Hello, boys and girls. I'm here to tell you about another doctor of the church, Saint John Chrysostom. He is a doctor from the East, and I thought I would read a little storybook with you. This is a book for kids that might make it more interesting for you. Since he's a saint of the East, I thought that some of the terms might be a little unusual for you. So let me just go over let me show you what the words look like. You know, one of the things I remember, our curriculum is logocentric. We focus on words. So just to get you comfortable, his name is St. John Chrysostom. He's known as Golden Tongue or Golden Mouth because the words from his sermons were so amazing to people. So he's come down in history with this name. He's from the 4th century. As you see, our big names, really, they're all from the 4th century. He's from Antioch, which is in Syria. So you could pause this video and go look at a map. A lot of times, boys and girls, as Roman Catholics, we tend to just think of Rome, and it's not good. We need to remember and breathe with both lungs. Our roots are actually in the East. We have the Cappadocian Fathers in what's Turkey. We have a very important root in Syria. So we need to remember our roots. You're going to meet people like Theodosius. You're going to meet the Patriarch of Constantinople, Theophilus of Alexandria. This is in Egypt. So we're looking at Egypt and Syria. Again, I would encourage you to go on a map. Eudoxia, the Empress, she's famous. Here are some titles of Chrysostom's most prominent works on the priesthood, homilies on the statues. That's kind of an interesting name, isn't it? I'm going to tell you the story, how that came to be, all right? Now, the storybook that I have is a little bit long, so I'm not going to read all of it, but I want to share it with you. St. John's feast day in the West, of course, we're Western Catholics, is, I believe it's September 13th, the day before the triumph of the cross, okay? In the Eastern Church, it's November 13th. So sit back and relax and let me read you a story. The sun beat down hard on the old city of Antioch as her streets bustled with the day's trading and selling. Busy people brushed by a young man on his way to school. John had no trouble negotiating the city streets he knew so well. After all, he'd been born and raised there. He knew not only the streets, but the heart of the city as well. Some years ago, a new spirit had entered it. Antioch was now more than a great center of trade. It was a dynamic center for the young church. John knew this, and indeed, it was right here. Okay, are you ready, boys and girls? This is the first city where the word Christian was used. So the very first time in history people called themselves Christians was in Antioch. What John didn't know was that one day he would be a great leader of this young church, and that the many people who passed by him so quickly would soon call him father and then bishop. John was born in 347 AD in Antioch, the largest city in Syria on the Orontes River. His father, Secundus, was a military man, but he died when John was still a baby. John's mother, Anthusa, never remarried, but devoted herself completely to caring for and educating her young son and his older sister. Anthusa was a devout Christian, teaching her children to love God in the church. As was a common custom in her day, she did not baptize John when he was a child. When he was 20, he was baptized and joined the church. He studied for several years under the bishop, and that's how he learned so much about the Bible. He was baptized in 369. John was very enthusiastic about his new life. In fact, his teachers and his friends noticed his new power of self-control. He longed to leave home and become a monk. When his mother saw this, she begged John not to leave her until she died, having lost her husband so long ago. John was the only man who could care for her in her old age. As much as John wanted to leave and pursue the life of a monk, he knew in his heart that his mother was right. He was still young and he could afford to wait. He finished his general education and began to practice his vocation as a lawyer, using all of the skills that he learned. A few friends, though, joined John in his desire to live as a monk. They noticed that John stayed away from parties and the theater. He preferred to live simply in study and in prayer. 3 of his fellow students, Maximus, Theodore, and Basil, all lived simply and encouraged one another. Although they were not trying to attract attention to themselves, people started to notice these 4 young men who lived such holy lives. In 373, when 2 positions for the bishop opened, John and Basil were immediately sought after. John secretly thought that Basil would make a good bishop, but he didn't feel ready for the task himself. There is a picture in the book. John took Basil aside and told him whatever they did, they would do together. They were brothers and friends. But John hid himself, and he saw to it that Basil would be with the crowd. Basil felt he had to listen to the people's wishes, and he was consecrated bishop. Now, Basil thought John was doing the same thing, but John, being his friend, and I don't know if you want to call it a prank, he didn't do it. Later, when Basil found out what John did, he was very angry. He wrote a few angry letters to John from his new episcopal see, and he accused him of breaking his word. John felt so bad, he wrote 6 letters of apologies called on the priesthood. He said, Basil, I did it for your own good. Their strong friendship held, and Basil forgave John for his pious trick on him. These 2 are great saints, so it's nice to hear this story. A few years later, John's mother died. After he buried her, he went to a nearby mountain and he lived like a monk. He spent 4 years in a community of monks, and he spent 2 years living in a cave. During this time, he got sick and he had to go back to Antioch to recuperate. The bishop who had baptized John was excited to see he was back in the city. He persuaded him to be a deacon, knowing that he was very well educated and would be a fine servant of the church. John took to his new task with fervor. A few years later, in 386, the bishop died, and the new archbishop, Flavian, ordained John a priest. John was given the duty to preach in the city, and soon the people of Antioch discovered what a wonderful preacher he was. For almost 12 years, he preached his famous sermons to crowds of listeners, and he became famous throughout the whole Eastern Empire. He filled his lessons with Bible stories and moral content. He tried to tell people to serve the church and God. He became an example to his people. The crowds who loved him were so large, he would warn the people to be careful of pickpockets. John's talent for persuasive speech was soon put to the test. After a year of being a priest, there was a great uproar in Antioch. The emperor Theodosius increased the taxes of the people, and the citizens were furious. They gathered in a mob, and they used ropes, and they toppled the statues of the emperor and his family. Can you imagine? They dragged the broken pieces throughout the streets. They yelled insults, and they committed violent acts. When the emperor in Constantinople heard the news, he said he was going to send the army to punish the people and kill them. The people were greatly frightened. John saw an opportunity to remind the people about the virtues of poverty and repentance while calming them down at the same time. It's a famous example of how he had to tell his people they were wrong, but he wanted to comfort them as well. He preached a series of 21 sermons called Homilies on the Statues. In the meantime, the archbishop went to Constantinople to beg the emperor not to destroy the city. In the middle of Lent, the imperial army arrived at the gates of the city to begin trials for the people who were responsible. The common people, though, listening to John, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and they lamented before the courts. All the rich aristocrats, the ones who were the most responsible, they fled to the mountains. The soldiers treated the people roughly, whether they were just passing by or dragging them off to court. When word of all of this reached the monks and the hermits in the mountains, they loved the people so much they left and came into the city. They went about the city and they scolded the soldiers for treating the people so poorly. On the eve of Easter, the archbishop returned and told John he had convinced the emperor to pardon the city. John was so joyful because he loved his people, even though they were wrong. He proclaimed the joyful news to the people. Antioch was spared. John's reputation as a great preacher reached far beyond his own city. In 397, when the patriarch of Constantinople died, John was named to be the new patriarch. A military escort was sent to whisk John away from Antioch because he knew that the people would not want to let John leave in his new post. John was consecrated patriarch of Constantinople by Theophilus, the patriarch of Alexandria. However, Theophilus was jealous. He didn't like all the attention that John got, and they had some long-standing disagreements. He agreed to the consecration, but he waited for an opportunity to discredit John. But John captured the imagination of his new flock by his brilliant preaching. The emperor's wife, Eudoxia, and they were both very happy with him, at least for a while. But soon they saw that John actually meant everything that he said. He preached against wealth and luxury, which was abundant in Constantinople. John sold all the rich ornaments of the bishop's residence, and he refused to attend parties and sumptuous banquets. He reformed the church and he disciplined the clergy. He helped the poor and did lots of works of charity. The common people loved their bishop and supported him, but the rich people did not. They did not want to share their wealth, and soon John had many enemies. John's enemies did not wait long to attack him. As Eudoxia assumed more power, she became his bitter enemy. John criticized in his sermons the lifestyle of rich people, and she took it personally. She engaged the help of Theophilus, who was so angry that some of the monks he expelled from Egypt had sought refuge in Constantinople. So behind the scenes, a lot of John's enemies are working against him. They called a synod at the Oak, which is like a sort of a fake church secret council, to get rid of him and banish him. However, the next day, a crowd of people stormed the palace and returned John's demands. Demanded the return of John. Eudoxia ignored them. She was glad to be free of this troublesome bishop, but you'll never guess what happened. That night, an earthquake rocked Constantinople, and it shook Eudoxia's bedroom so hard that she became frightened that she had angered God by treating John so poorly. She begged the emperor to bring John back. Messengers were sent to John's boat with humble apologies, begging him to return. When the people heard he was returning, they launched their little boats to meet him in the harbor, and the docks were lined with men and women carrying torches and singing songs and rejoicing. They raised him up on his episcopal chair and carried him away with great joy. Here's a picture. Can you imagine what it looked like with all of those boats? Now, sadly, the new peace between John and this vengeful empress did not last long. Eudoxia, bored with all the luxuries of her palace, started to look for new ways to amuse herself. She decided it would be nice to have some of the same honors that past pagan rulers had. She commissioned a skilled silversmith to create a beautiful statue of her. When it was finished, she set it up in the public square with great celebration. The commotion disrupted the services that were taking place in the church. John was furious. He preached fiery sermons against her and the statue that she was making of herself. Now the empress was determined to get rid of John, regardless of the consequences. Together with other enemies, she persuaded the emperor to order him to stop being a bishop, and he refused. But on Holy Saturday in the year 404, as John went to the church to baptize the catechumens, imperial guards came and they dragged him away from the cathedral. The people in the church tried to protect their beloved pastor, but they were driven away as well. A few days after Pentecost, John agreed to leave Constantinople secretly because he didn't want a popular uprising among the people on his behalf. He was taken to a remote mountain village. Even though he was parted from his flock, he continued to write them letters and give them spiritual direction. And actually, the pure mountain climate made him feel better, and his influence among the people remained powerful. He even made plans to go to Persia to have a mission. In 405, he had to leave his little mountain hamlet to escape from barbarians. He came to Arabassus, where crowds welcomed him. But Eudoxia didn't want people to remember John, and the more she heard of his popularity, the more upset she became. In 407, she sent orders to take John on a difficult journey by foot to the furthest corner of the empire. This long march and this exposure to the extremes of heat and cold was too much for the aging bishop. After 3 months, he told his guards, "Let me stop and pray." They took him to a chapel. There he received Holy Communion and he died. And they wrote down his last words, which were, "Glory be to God for all things." He was buried alongside the martyr in whose name the little chapel was dedicated. It's a chapel near Comana. 31 years later, in 438 AD, everyone had forgotten the long dead empress, but no one had forgotten John. The local people revered him as a saint. They took his body and with great celebration brought it back to Constantinople. And the children of the emperor had him placed in a tomb, and they actually repented and begged forgiveness for what their parents had done. Isn't that a beautiful ending? I like that. So, as I told you, John is called golden-mouthed, and we love his teachings, but I think it's important to hear the story of his life and to remember he is a pillar in our church. He's a doctor of the church, he's a father of the church, and he's one of the 4 big ones in the East. So we pray, Saint John Chrysostom, ora pro nobis.